Hello, and welcome to the second installment of the Simpson College Faculty Showcase series. Today, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Chad Timm, a 1995 graduate of Simpson College, to give a speech today about POW camps in Iowa during World War II. But with no further ado, Professor of Education and Department Chair, Chad Timm.
Well, hello, and thank you for being here. I'm gonna not waste a whole lot of time because I have quite a bit to say. I would like to say that I'm a member of the Humanities Iowa Speakers Bureau, and the Humanities Iowa Speakers Bureau is an organization that's funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and there's about 30 folks who travel around the state and give talks on topics of Iowa culture and Iowa history. And what I'm going to share with you today is about 35 or 40 minutes of a presentation that could be much longer. And so if you're interested in having someone from Humanities Iowa come to your local community, to a public library or a historical society, please reach out. I'll also share a link to this presentation with Andy, and hopefully he can make that available. And back in 2011, I wrote an essay for the Annals of Iowa, which is an Iowa history journal, on this particular topic as well. And so there's more information in that journal article. And if you would like to have access to that, you can reach out to me at chad.timm@simpson.edu, and I'd be happy to share it with you. This is a topic that I'm passionate about and have been connected to and researching and writing about since the early 2000s. And growing up in Iowa, and going to Simpson College and getting a degree in history, I had no idea until I was in graduate school that between 1943 and 1946, more than 40,000 German, Italian, and Japanese prisoners of war lived in the state of Iowa, worked on Iowa farms, worked in hemp mills and sugar beet factories in north central Iowa, and ensured that Iowa farmers were able to complete the tasks that the War Food Administration had asked them to complete. And so what I'd like to do is to kind of give you a little bit of background on this particular story, and then we'll move right through it. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the United States had a decision to make because Adolf Hitler and Germany declared war on the United States after we declared war on Japan. And the question was, are we going to focus, where are we going to focus our effort? And if you remember, by 1942, in January of 1942, the British had been kicked off the European continent with Dunkirk, and the British were in desperate need of aid. And the Soviet Union was fighting the war pretty much by themselves on the Eastern Front as the Battle of Britain was picking up. And so the British and Soviet governments were interested in establishing a second front, and the decision was made to attempt to establish a second front in North Africa. So in 1942, during the North African campaign, the British and American and other allied forces took more German and Italian prisoners of war during that campaign than in the 2.5 years of the war prior combined. And the British government had nowhere to put these prisoners of war. And the British government said to the United States government that you've got vessels sailing across the Atlantic full of weapons, full of supplies, full of American troops, and then sailing back to the United States empty. Why don't you fill these vessels up with German and Italian prisoners of war and ship them back to the United States? After quite a bit of negotiation and after quite a bit of debate, the United States government eventually agreed to house some of these German and Italian prisoners of war. And by early 1943, there were approximately 5,000 German and Italian prisoners of war in camps around the United States of America. But by the end of 1943, there were more than 150,000 German and Italian prisoners of war in the United States. And ultimately, by 1946, there would be more than 375,000 German, Italian, and eventually Japanese prisoners of war in the United States, and more than 300 camps scattered throughout the country. Two of those prisoner of war camps were in Iowa. One camp was in north central Iowa in Kossuth County near Algona, and the other camp was in southwestern Iowa in Page County in Clarinda. And I'm going to give you some background as to why the camps came to Iowa and what life was like in these camps, and and what the relationship was between Iowans and these prisoners of war. On this particular map, some of the other hearts that you can see are some of the other communities in Iowa where smaller branch camps were established. And I'll talk more about those a little bit later. So a question that I often get asked when I give this presentation is, why Iowa? Why did prisoners of war come to Iowa between 1943 and 1946? And there are a few reasons for that. One reason is that one of Iowa's two senators, Guy Gillette, was the chairman of the Senate Agricultural Committee, and he was the highest ranking member of the United States Senate as it related to issues of agriculture. And in 1943, when those first German and Italian prisoners of war began arriving in the United States, Guy Gillette knew that in places like Louisiana, German prisoners of war were harvesting sugarcane. And I believe that one of the reasons that POW camps came to Iowa was that Guy Gillette, who was a veteran of the Spanish-American War and knew agriculture inside and out, saw the possible benefit that prisoners of war could bring to the state of Iowa. And I say that because the War Food Administration was the government entity that was asking Iowans to grow more and produce more in order to help provide for the war effort. And I've read War Food Administration documents that describe the farmland in Iowa, especially north central Iowa, as some of the most fertile in the world, not in the country, but in the world. And so between 1942 and 1943, the War Food Administration was asking Iowans to grow more, to plant more, and not only growing and planting crops like corn and beans, but when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941 and they captured many of the islands in the South Pacific, the United States lost access to our sisal rope, and we also lost access to the majority of our supply of sugar. And so Iowans during World War II began growing hemp, and we opened hemp mills in north and north central Iowa, where Iowa farmers would grow hemp. The hemp would be processed into rope, and that rope would be sold to the United States government. Iowa farmers also began growing sugar beets, and we opened sugar beet plants where those sugar beets would be processed into sugar. And so my point, I guess, is to say that Iowans were being asked to do more. Iowans were being asked to produce more and to grow more. But the 18 to 25-year-old men that Iowans relied on as farm laborers in the busy spring and fall seasons were being drafted and sent overseas. By 1943, more than 70,000 Iowans had been drafted and were fighting in the war. And those were 70,000 young men who may have been helpful as farm laborers during the spring planting and the fall harvest season. And so while Iowans were being asked to do more, they were being asked to do more with less. And I believe that Guy Gillette knew the possible benefits that having POW camps in Iowa could potentially bring. And in fact, the first POWs that came to Iowa actually came to Iowa from Missouri. There was a camp in Missouri called Camp Weingarten. And in early 1943, DeKalb and Pioneer, which are two larger companies that prior to 1943 annually would hire migratory farm workers to detassel in the summer. And this was part of a program that Franklin Roosevelt created in 1936 called the Bracero Program, where Mexican migrant farm workers in particular were hired by American corporations to engage in seasonal farm work. Well, because of the demands nationwide for farm laborers, because ultimately we're going to have millions of young American men and women who are fighting overseas and not available to provide short-term farm labor, DeKalb and Pioneer could not get access to migrant farm workers in 1943. And so DeKalb contracted with Camp Weingarten in Missouri, and they brought 300 Italian prisoners of war to Iowa in July of 1943. And those POWs worked in particular on the largest ranch in the state of Iowa. It's called the Adams Ranch. It's a ranch with 6,400 acres near Otobote in Sac County. And Italian POWs in the summer of 1943, they harvested 270 acres of flax, 685 acres of oats, and 1,065 acres in tame hay, 1,040 acres of red clover, and 10 acres of potatoes on the Adams Ranch. And I tell you that story because in the summer of 1943, Iowans successfully utilized Italian prisoners of war as farm laborers. And I believe that word got out and local Iowa communities began submitting contracts to the United States government to build prisoners of war camps. And the United States government agreed and granted 2 contracts, one in Clarinda and one in Algona. If you can imagine, in August of 1943, folks in Clarinda and Algona received notification from the United States government that prisoner of war camps were going to be built in their communities. And it's difficult to wrap my head around what that might have been like. I looked carefully at the local newspapers in Page County and in Kossuth County, and it was pretty much a surprise that in August of 1943, both the Clarinda Herald-Journal in Page County and the Algona Upper Des Moines published stories stating that government officials had been in town surveying sites for potential prisoner of war camps. And there was very little warning. Iowans in those communities were notified that within 2 to 4 months, prisoner of war camps were going to be constructed just outside of town. Both in Algona and in Clarinda, the camps were constructed on the same architectural design, 186 acres. Each camp cost $1 million to build in 1943. And essentially the camps were like little cities. The photograph I have here on this slide is of Camp Algona. And I just want to give a plug for the folks in Algona. They are incredibly proud of the history of the camp there. They have a museum that is fantastic. And so if you have an opportunity to go to North Central Iowa and visit Algona to see the museum that they have dedicated to the POW camp that was there, I would highly recommend that you do so. The photograph that you see here in this image is an aerial photograph of Camp Algona. And each of the camps, both in Algona and in Clarinda, were identical camps. They consisted of 4 compounds, 3 for prisoners and the 4th for an American garrison. The camp would house up to 3,000 prisoners of war and 500 American troops in 186 buildings. They had machine gun towers at all 4 corners. The camps were surrounded with barbed wire. They had 20 frame barracks, each that would house 50 men. And once completed, the camps included a post theater, a church, a fire station, an ice house, a machine shop, barn, hospital, electric distribution system, and water and sewage facilities. I interviewed folks in both Clarinda and Algona in the early 2000s who remember the camps being there. And I talked to folks in Algona who told me how unhappy some of the folks in town were that the water facilities at the camp were better than what they had in town. And there was a little bit of tension, I have to admit, that especially in Algona, because a portion of the property that was used to build the camp just outside of town was part of a farm that was a heritage farm. And the folks who had the land did not want to give the land up, but the United States government acquired the land through eminent domain, and the camps were built. So each of the camps, like I said, would be identical, and the camp construction began in August of 1943, and both camps were completed by late December, early January of 1944. And let me change slides here. When the camps were opened, on the left is a photograph of the entrance of Camp Algona, and this is from the Camp Algona Museum, from their collection. And what I will say is that the camp commander at Camp Clarinda was a man named Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lobdell. Lieutenant Colonel Lobdell was in public relations before the war broke out. And between August and January, August of 43 and January 44, Lieutenant Colonel Lobdell crafted a public relations. He masterfully engaged in a public relations campaign to prepare the people of Clarinda for this camp. And he, it was quite incredible, as a matter of fact. By late December of 1943, when the camp was completed, he opened the gates of the camp and allowed everyone in town to drive their cars around the camp facilities to see what the camp was going to look like when the first enemy prisoners of war arrived. And as a result, in Clarinda in particular, the people in the local community, I wouldn't say that they were excited that the camps were coming, but they were prepared for the camps, and they had resigned themselves to the fact that the camps were a way that they could help with the war effort. In the early 2000s, I was in Clarinda and I interviewed a woman named Corinne Gerker, and Corinne Gerker was the camp commander's private secretary. She was 18 years old in 1944 when the camp opened. And I asked her, I said, Corinne, were people worried about German and Italian prisoners of war coming to Clarinda? And she chuckled and she said, my parents were more worried about the 500 American GIs coming to Clarinda than they were about the German POWs. And it's kind of incredible to think that both Clarinda and Algona had populations of about 2,500 people before the camps were created. And for the construction of the camps, they needed carpenters, they needed metal workers, they needed folks to roof and to pour the concrete and to do the electrical. And so when 3,000 POWs and 500 American troops eventually come to these two communities, the populations of the two communities essentially double. And it actually brought quite a bit of revenue into the local community. Something that I'll refer to a little bit later. On the right-hand side, I have a cutout from the Red Oak Express. This is a news article from December of 1943. And it shows this is an American soldier wearing a POW uniform. And I'm going to zoom in and read this to you in case you can't see it that clearly on your screen, but it says, the garb of the prisoner of war becomes of interest to Iowans due to the December 15th activation of the prisoner camp at Clarinda. A United States Army officer poses in these pictures to show Iowans what the work uniforms of the prisoner of war look like. The letter PW, prisoner of war, are conspicuously marked on the coats, shirts, blouses, and jackets of the work uniform, but not on national uniforms of officer prisoners and prisoner enlisted men. Escapes are rare, but military authorities ask any person observing a suspicious individual or prowler wearing a PW outer garment or any part of a German uniform to collect the telephone operator at Clarinda. So just an FYI, if you happen to see somebody walking around town in a German uniform, call the camp and they will take care of that. So in January of 1944, within a couple of days of each other, both camps open and they received their first contingents of enemy prisoners of war. And in both Clarinda and Algona, the first POWs to arrive were German soldiers from the North Africa campaign. And the camp at Clarinda opened and began functioning rather smoothly, but that was not the case at Camp Algona. There was a little bit of unrest at Algona because there was a small group of hardcore Nazis, I guess, for lack of a better term, in the POW contingent at Algona. And I guess what I'll say is that not all German soldiers were members of the National Socialist Party. There were German soldiers who were members of the Nazi Party, and they typically fought in similar units. And when the United States government identified POWs, German POWs who were members of these Nazi units, they tended to send them to one prisoner of war camp in Oklahoma. And when the camp at Algona opened in January of 1944, there was a group of about 30 of these hardcore Nazis who were determined to prevent the camp from functioning smoothly. And so within a few weeks of the camp's opening, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lobdell was transferred from Camp Clarinda and replaced by a man named Lieutenant Colonel George Ball. And Lobdell was sent to Algona to get the camp at Algona up and running smoothly. And Lobdell did that. He identified who those 30 hardcore Nazi German prisoners were, and he put them in solitary confinement on bread and water diets until they agreed to comply. And eventually he was able to get that camp up and running smoothly as well. There were concerns, and these are national concerns. And by the way, if you're interested in reading about the experiences of prisoners of war in the United States more broadly, the expert on this subject is a historian at Texas A&M University named there's a lot of Arthurs, named Arnold Kramer, Krammer. And Arnold Kramer has written a book called Nazis in America, which is a book that pretty much details the POW experience nationwide, whereas my talk today is focusing specifically on Iowa. And what Lobdell describes is that it was important for camp officials to give the prisoners of war in these camps things to do, for lack of a better word, to keep them busy. And so within the camps, each camp, and this is true in Algona and this is true in Clarinda, sought to keep those prisoners of war busy. And they did so through recreational activities. They did so through work. And I'm going to talk more about work here in a few minutes, but the Geneva Convention of 1929 specified that prisoners of war could be utilized for work as long as the work did not directly benefit the war effort. And so the camp officials at both Algona and Clarinda could require prisoners of war to work on the campgrounds. But if they worked on the campgrounds, those POWs would be paid 10 cents a day. And the POWs could receive payment in two ways. One, they could open a kind of like a savings account, and the money that they earned from working on the camp could be put into this savings account, and then that savings account would be liquidated when the war ended and they were repatriated and sent back home. Most POWs, however, exchanged their labor for coupons that they could use at the camp canteen. And in the camp canteen, they could purchase books and magazines, and they could purchase other supplies that were provided by the International Red Cross. And with some of those supplies, German POWs actually created works of art. These are all images that come from the museum at Algona, and they are works of art that were painted by German POWs. And so I'm just going to click through some of these quickly. This painting depicts German soldiers working in a field being guarded by American troops. This is a photograph of a German prisoner of war at Camp Algona named Edward Kaib. This is a fascinating story, but in the winter of 1945, Edward, not 1945, during the Christmas season of 1945, Edward Kaib was inspired. As the story goes, German soldiers were singing Christmas songs in German, and American soldiers in the camp compounds heard them singing these songs, and American soldiers began singing Christmas songs in English. And essentially, these German prisoners of war and American soldiers were serenading each other, essentially, and experiencing this incredible Christmas spirit. Edward Kaib was so moved by what he experienced at Camp Algona that he carved a nativity scene that was about 1/64th life size. And this is a photograph of Kaib with two of the figures that he carved. And I have another photograph here. This is a photograph of the nativity scene at Camp Algona. And when Edward Kaib was, when the war ended and Kaib went back to Germany, he left the nativity scene as a gift to the people of Algona for the way that the German POWs there were treated. And during the holiday season, if you're in Algona, they actually displayed this nativity scene. And I would encourage you to get up there and take a look at it if you have the chance. This is a newspaper article, a newspaper clipping from the Clarinda Herald Journal from May of 1944. And it says, soccer, a sport which is considered Europe's football, is proving popular at Camp Clarinda in the prisoner of war camp. Evenings, people of Clarinda hear rousing cheers and have learned from POW officers that it comes from the prisoners who are playing their favorite sport. Another outdoor game is similar to tennis. The racket is long handled like badminton, the net is high, but those who have watched it compare it to tennis. For indoor sports, officers of the camp point out the German prisoners spend most of their time at chess. One of my favorite stories about German soldiers and the camp canteen, and by the way, these are photographs of some of the coupons that German soldiers would exchange for their labor for these coupons, and you can see these are 50 cent, 25 cent, 1 cent coupons. Early in 1944, when I interviewed Corinne Gerker, she told me a story that, as many of you probably know, during World War II, there were a lot of items in the United States that were rationed in order to make them available to American men and women who were fighting overseas. And some items that were rationed were cigarettes and Hershey's chocolate bars and beer, canned beer. And Corinne Gerker told me that local Iowans in the Clarinda area found out that German soldiers were exchanging their camp canteen coupons for beer, cigarettes, and Hershey candy bars when folks in the local community had a hard time getting access to those supplies. And so folks in Page County in the Clarinda area complained to the camp officials, who put a stop to it. And Corinne told me that The German soldiers didn't care because they said the beer was weak anyway. But what she told me was that the German soldiers began hoarding fruit rinds and vegetables, and they had stills in their barracks where they made their own liquor. There was only a small handful of recorded escape attempts in the camps. Camp Clarinda, there were no successful escape attempts, and at Camp Algona, local newspapers sometimes ran stories describing how people were concerned about escapes, rumors of escapes, people driving out and driving around the campgrounds and telling stories of seeing suspicious individuals. But to my knowledge, there was only one successful escape attempt in the Algona area, and this occurred in June of 1944. And this is an article from the reporter from Fenton, Iowa, that says 2 German prisoners of war from the Algona camp were captured by Marshal Irvin DeWitt of West Bend last week, Wednesday, on the Mike Klepper farm east of West Bend. They made their escape attempt Sunday morning previous at an early hour during a heavy rainstorm by cutting a hole in the compound fence large enough for them to crawl through and then patch it up so that only the closest scrutiny might discover the cuts. There were few escape attempts for a couple of reasons. One, German soldiers who could speak English expressed concern about where they would go. I mean, in the middle of Iowa, it's not like we were close to a coast or close to a border where they could potentially escape. But for the most part, the prisoners of war had no real reason to escape. They were fed and they were treated well, probably better than they would have been fed or treated had they been fighting overseas, which is something that I'll come back to here in just a minute. So I do want to talk about one of talk about a significant element of the POW program. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier when I said that Iowa farmers by 1943 had 70 fewer farm laborers to help them meet the food goals that had been established by the War Food Administration. And so when the camps opened in 1944, there was hope that these POWs could be potentially used as farm laborers. And as I had said previously, the Geneva Convention specified that prisoners of war could be required to work on the campgrounds, and they would be paid 10 cents a day. For example, each of the POW camps had a garden, and the garden was comprised of 50 to 60 acres where the prisoners grew their own vegetables. And POWs could earn 10 cents a day for working in their garden or for working in the mess hall or what have you. The Geneva Convention also specified that POWs could work outside of the campgrounds, but they had to volunteer to do so. And if they did work outside of the campgrounds, then there was a kind of a laborious process by which local folks had to get access to those prisoners of war. So in early 1944, this was the procedure in order for a farmer or for a local business owner to employ a prisoner of war. They had to run an ad in a local newspaper looking for help. They had to present that ad to camp officials saying that they couldn't find help. And then in the initial phases of the camp's opening, they had to need at least 10 POWs. So in other words, if a local farmer needed help in the spring during the planting season in March or April of 1944, they needed to need, I guess, 10 prisoners of war in order to get access to them. Well, most farmers didn't need 10 POWs for short-term farm labor help. And so in the first couple of months of the spring planting season, there were very few POWs who were being used on Iowa farms in Page or Kossuth County. And in my research, what I found was really the heroes of the POW story in many ways were local county extension agents who recognized that the process wasn't working and the bureaucratic red tape was preventing farmers from getting access to POWs. And so they sprung to action. And in both Page County, where Camp Clarinda was located, and in Kossuth County, where Algona was located, the county extension agents both created what were called emergency farm labor associations. And these emergency farm labor associations pooled together money from local farmers, and they contracted, or they didn't contract, but they requested to the local camp a pool of POW labor. And so instead of one farmer, let's say Chad Timm needs to use 3 POWs to help pull weeds out of a bean field, I wouldn't be able to get access to them because the government said that I needed to request 10. Well, these emergency farm labor associations had a pool of about 30 German POWs that individual farmers could access POWs from that pool. And so the Farm Labor Association contacted the camp and said, we need this number of POWs. And then individual farmers could access those POWs from that pool. And so really these county extension agents were some of the early heroes in helping local farmers get access to POW labor. One other thing that I want to say is that in order for a farmer to use a POW, they needed to pay the government 60 cents an hour to use that prisoner of war. And that 60 cents an hour was based on an approximation of the hourly wage that a farm laborer might have earned in 1944. So, I'm a historian, I'm not a mathematician, but if the government is paying, and I guess I didn't mention this, but the POWs were paid 10 cents a day for work on the campgrounds and 80 cents a day for work outside of the campgrounds. And so if a POW worked on your farm, the government would pay them 80 cents a day, and you would pay the government 60 cents an hour. And so you're paying the government 60 cents an hour, and the government is paying the POW 80 cents a day. And so there was the potential for quite a bit of revenue to be generated from the POW labor program. I'm going to click through some photographs here. These are photographs of German POWs working on Iowa farms. I'm pretty sure that the photograph on the left shows a German POW working in a sugar beet field. I'm sorry, I'm moving quickly through these, but I want to make sure that I stay on time. Initially, if a farmer was going to utilize POW laborers, they needed to live within about 30 miles of the camp, because if you lived more than 30 miles from one of these 2 main camps, then you spent more money in gas getting to and from the camp than made it worthwhile. And so in mid-1944, the United States government adopted a policy whereby smaller branch camps could be established, where POWs would go from the main camp to a smaller camp in a local community. And most of these branch camps would house between 50 and 150 or 200 POWs. And in 1944 and 1945, Camp Algona, for example, administered 34 branch camps in 4 states: Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Iowa. And Camp Algona operated branch camps in Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska. And this is a copy of a map that was on the wall of Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lobdell. And you can see the large star in the center shows Camp Algona. And then each one of these little squares is a calendar. And the calendars are, the squares are filled in for the months of the year that a branch camp operated in that community. So some of the other small towns in Iowa that had smaller branch camps were places like Storm Lake, Ottawa, Muscatine, Clinton, Toledo, Waverly, Charles City. If you're from any of those communities, then it's possible that German POWs lived there for part of 1944 or 1945 and may have worked in your community. During the 1944 and 1944 farm season, POWs engaged in a variety of work. They repaired storm damage along the Missouri River in 1944. There was massive flooding in 1944 along the Missouri River, and they helped to fix levees and dikes there. They worked on farmers' fields. They built fence. They pulled weeds. They detasseled. In places like Traer, Iowa, German POWs worked in a hemp mill that was in Traer. In Toledo, Iowa, German POWs worked there as well. They in the 1944 and 1945 seasons, the German POWs did quite a bit of work, and they developed relationships with farmers that were nothing short of remarkable. Richard Norton, whose father hired German POWs to work on his farm, noted, "My father had hired a group of them to pull the cockleburs in the bean fields. The guard I discovered when I took some cold soft drinks out to them was asleep between the bean rows." I interviewed Albert Wellhausen, who told me they were mostly good workers, and he considered one in particular the best laborer he had ever employed. Dorothy Johnston told me an occasion when her husband was forced to leave home and tend to a sick relative, and rather than fear for the welfare of his farm, he said, "Bruno will know what to do." Bruno was a German POW who spent the better part of a year working on the Johnston's farm. One Algonans expressed a typical and crucial observation when she explained, "I remember watching the long train arrive and looking hard at the windows, looking for a monster. I looked right into the eyes of one of them, and to my surprise, the POW looked like everyone else. They looked like one of us." Dorothy Johnson said, "We really got acquainted with them. If my son was over there, I hope someone would treat him as well. When the Germans left, they drove them around the square. We all waved, and some of us cried." Really, this story it's a two-part story. Part one of the story is the way in which folks in Algona and Clarinda saw themselves in the German POWs. Both of these communities are staunchly German American communities. I interviewed people who said that there were still folks in the Algona area who were speaking German in the 1930s and 1940s. And I believe that folks in Iowa, in these German soldiers, they saw their brothers and they saw their sons, and they saw young men who were drafted to fight a war that just like our young men and women, young men in particular, were drafted to fight a war. The second part of the story, and I'm running short on time, the second part of the story is more complicated. And that is that in January of 1945, after a successful season with POWs being utilized in both Algona and Clarinda and all across the state, essentially, the German POWs in Clarinda were shipped out, and they were shipped to Algona, and they were replaced by Japanese POWs. There were only 2 POW camps in the country that housed Japanese prisoners of war. One was at Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, and the other was at Camp Clarinda in Page County, Iowa. We took, as a nation, we took fewer than 10,000 Japanese soldiers prisoner during the war, compared to the more than 360,000 German prisoners who were housed in the United States. Fewer than 10,000 of them were Japanese POWs. And local farmers were less inclined to utilize the Japanese POWs as laborers. And at the end of the day, there were racist stereotypes in the local media and among the camp officials that showed a real lack of understanding of the Japanese. And as a result, local farmers were hesitant to use Japanese POWs. Eventually, and I do want to tell you one story, because a branch camp, after the German POWs left Camp Clarinda and went to Algona, a branch camp was opened in Shenandoah, Iowa, which is 15 miles from Camp Clarinda. And German POWs were shipped back from Algona to Shenandoah so that local farmers could get access to their labor, because they were refusing to use the Japanese POWs. The general who was in charge of the 7th Service Command, which is the service command that was in charge of all the POW camps in the Midwest, ordered the camp commander at Camp Clarinda, Lieutenant Colonel George Ball, to put the Japanese POWs to work. And so in March of 1945, for the first time, Japanese POWs left the camp confines and were hired to work on a farm just west of Clarinda, between Clarinda and Shenandoah. And the farmer's name was Elmer Hodson. When the German POWs would work, they got paid 80 cents a day, no matter how much work was completed. The stereotype that the American officials and local farmers had of Japanese soldiers was that they were lazy and that they wouldn't work well. And so Lieutenant Colonel George Ball, who was the commander of Camp Clarinda, said, "We're not going to pay these Japanese POWs 80 cents a day to do nothing, and we're going to pay them by the hour, which was a mistake because the Japanese worked so hard on their first day that each of the Japanese soldiers shucked between 52 and 53 bushels of corn per man. And by the end of the day, they each had earned more than $1 for the work that they had done. And after that day, Lieutenant Colonel Ball said they had to go back to the policy they used with the Germans, where they paid the Japanese by the day and not by the hour, because the Japanese proved to be such hard workers. Nursery operators, and I didn't know this until I started doing research on this story, but in Page County, Iowa, Page and Fremont County, Iowa, there were more acres of nurseries in those two counties than in any other counties in the country. And the Japanese POWs were hired by Earl May Nursery in particular in 1945 to work on their nurseries. And I have a quote here. Nursery operators told Lieutenant Colonel Ball that they were well pleased with the good job performed by the Japanese from May to August of 45. And the Shenandoah nurseries employed 9,609 man days of Japanese labor, which is an 8-hour workday. One man day is one 8-hour workday, while employing 6,750 man days of German labor. I have a photograph here from the Des Moines Register. This is the only photograph that I'm aware of that depicts Japanese prisoners of war. It's 12:41, and I'm running out of time. And so what I want to say is that the war ends in Europe in May of 1945. And then in August of 1945, with the surrender of Germany in May and Japan in August of 45, the camps do not close, however, until early 1946. In early 1946, the Japanese POWs are moved from Clarinda to the West Coast, and the German POWs are sent back to Europe. We had an agreement with the German government that those POWs would be repatriated, meaning that we wanted our POWs back, they wanted their POWs back. And so the German POWs did not stay in the United States, they were sent back to Europe, although in time, some of those German prisoners of war would return to the United States, and some of them, in fact, returned to Iowa.
Well, thank you very much, Chad. Very informative, and sorry that we didn't have more time, but we will open it up for some questions and answers here. The first question that came in is, does Clarinda have a museum as well?
They don't have a museum, but there's the Nottoway Valley Historical Museum. They do have a small museum that's not dedicated necessarily just to the camp, but it's dedicated to that particular area. And they do have information about the camp there, yes.
Okay. And another question was, were POWs transferred to the Iowa camps from other states? And if so, how common was this?
That's a good question. They typically weren't transported from one POW camp to another POW camp. They may have traveled through other states and stayed in other states on their way to get to Clarinda and to Algona, but for the most part, when the POWs arrived in Clarinda in January of 44, they came straight from Europe, and many of them still had wounds from their experience there. And I won't say that it never happened. I mean, like I said, those POWs, German POWs that we identified as being quote unquote hardcore Nazis, were sent to a camp in Oklahoma. So there may have been some movement of POWs between camp to camp, but typically they came straight to Iowa.
Okay. Would there have been Japanese interpreters at the camps? And also, did Iowa have any Japanese Americans who were placed in internment camps as opposed to POWs?
Great question. I would love to tell more about this story. Number one, I do not know if there were any Japanese Americans from Iowa who were interned in internment camps. Most of the Japanese Americans that were placed in internment camps as a result of Franklin Roosevelt's executive order, I think it was Executive Order 9066, were from the West Coast. There were Japanese American students at Iowa State College at the time. And if I'm not mistaken, I've been told stories of Japanese American students at Simpson College in the 1940s. But in terms of Iowans who were Japanese American, I don't know the answer to that question. What I will tell you is that the interpreters at Camp Clarinda, this is a great story that I wish I had more time to get into. The interpreters were members of the 442nd Infantry Combat Infantry Unit. These were Japanese American men who enlisted in the Army and they served overseas. And if you're interested, you should do some research or look up the 442nd. They were the most highly decorated combat infantry unit in American military history. And they were Japanese American men who I think felt they especially felt the need to demonstrate their loyalty in these times. Other questions? So they were the interpreters at Camp Clarinda.
We have a comment, a recommendation that came in. It says, I recommend speaking with Linda Betzinger McCann. She is the author of several books, including Prisoners of War in Iowa. Or was that from you, Chad?
No, that's not from
From
me.
Okay.
Linda, I've talked to Linda, and she was traveling around the state, I think, in the last couple of years before COVID, talking about the research that she has done as well. So yeah, I'm familiar with Linda.
And were you able to talk with any families that used the prison laborers, and approximately how many?
Yeah, I did. I spoke to about 10 families in Clarinda in the early 2000s. And so this was about 2001 and 2002. And by that time, the folks that I talked to were in their 80s, and they employed German POWs. One of the Johnson family I talked to in the early 2000s told me a story of that German POW that I mentioned. His name was Bruno. When Bruno went back to Germany after the war, he wrote letters to the Johnson family talking about how difficult it was for his family. They were essentially starving because, remember, Germany was pretty much economically and physically destroyed at the end of the war. And the Johnson family sent him 10 care packages of more than $2,000 worth of supplies to help his family get through those hard times. And in the early 1980s, there were a group of German POWs who returned to Iowa, and they did a tour of the whole state. And Bruno was reunited with the Johnson family, and he paid them back the money that they had given him in his time of need. So I interviewed about 10 families in the Clarinda area. In Algona, great work of a high school history teacher. There's a high school history teacher at Algona High School who during the early 2000s took his students to local retirement centers and had them conduct oral histories of folks who remember the camps. And there's some pretty fantastic documentation of what they remember. And you can see a lot of that at the camp in Algona.
I think this will be our last question. This is an important part of Iowa's history, and another example of history that is not taught. How do we change that?
That's a great question. I don't have the answer for you. What I will know, what I will tell you is that most of the people I talk to don't know that this happened in Iowa. But everywhere I go, and I've given a similar talk in 50 different communities in Iowa, from Muscatine to Harlan, Iowa, the great people of the town of Harlan, Iowa. And everywhere I go, I run into people who have a personal connection to this. For example, I gave this talk in Waverly, and there was a branch camp in Waverly. And I had a gentleman come up to me afterwards, and he told me that when he was a kid, he remembers a German POW that stayed in their home for 2 weeks. Instead of that POW going back to the branch camp every day, they just let him stay in their house, and he ate with them and he worked with them. And it's remarkable. And so I guess this particular story, one of the ways that we can keep it alive is to continue to tell it. And I will come anywhere that anybody asks me to come and share this story. And I would encourage you to do the same.
All right. Well, with that, Chad, thank you so much for your time today and for all of this information. If I do receive any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly and I can pass those along to Chad, or feel free to contact Chad directly as well. But thank you all for being here today, and a special thank you to you, Chad. Have a great day, everybody.
Take care.